The Capitoline Hill, Rome's own sacred mountain, that urban Roman Olympus. We've been hovering here for the past few episodes because it was home to the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno and Minerva, and because the Capitoline Hill was the seat of Rome's greatest divine power, the place where Jupiter Optimus Maximus, best and greatest, resided. We've seen how the great Capitoline temple that was built up here outshone and overshadowed all other gods. And there can be no doubt that Roman society held Jupiter as the superlative of their gods, and it's clear that they came to present him as unrivaled in his power and glory. However, we've been hovering up here on this most sacred, elevated spot because we've been discovering other un-Olympian deities that also resided up here and who unsettle that familiar narrative with their own stories and by their very presence. Their mere existence draws into question the true face of Roman religion, not as it was romanticized by poets or advertised in propaganda, or indeed as it's popularly remembered today, but rather how it was lived and experienced in the life and times of real people who called Rome home. And we've been lingering up here in the shadier corners of the Capitoline with deities like Terminus and Sumanus, because if I can convince you that even the king of the gods was not, in Rome, the only thunderer, and if his powers were not quite of the exclusive, uncontested and uncompromised control we tend to imagine, then cracks appear at the very top. Cracks that show this is no carbon copy of Zeus after all. These are cracks in the veneer of that endlessly repeated Greek myth through which we catch glimpses of Rome's own gods and indigenous traditions, jostling side by side with those who would steal the historical limelight. And cracks at the top go all the way down. So in this episode, before descending into the ancient city to search its streets, its byways and back alleys for the manifold gods living down there among the populace, we give Jupiter and his giant temple on that most sacred hill one last shake to its foundations. And the name of the god responsible for this most troubling of cracks is Vediovis, the Dark Child. When you visit the Capitoline Hill today, what you see is the Piazza del Campidoglio, designed in the Renaissance by Michelangelo himself. He was commissioned by Pope Paul III to create a new symbol of Rome on that historically significant site, and he completely remodeled it. He turned its orientation away from the old heart of empire, the Roman Forum below, turning it instead to the new religious heart of papal Rome, the Vatican. It was a conscious turning of Rome from the old gods to the new. Standing in that sweeping piazza now, all pointing in the wrong direction and flattened out, it can be difficult to imagine how the place once looked when it was bejewelled with temples and approached reverentially from the Forum. When you come up the monumental staircase now from the other side, you are faced with the restoration of civic governmental buildings, the Palazzo dei Conservatori in front of you, and on either side, left and right, is now the Capitoline Museum. This is one of my favourite museums in the whole world, by the way. If you're interested in ancient Roman history, this place is full of treasures. Inside, you'll find oddly protruding at awkward angles these giant bare stone walls jutting into an exhibition area within the museum. They're enormous. They're all that remains of Jupiter's once great temple, but, giant as they are, these are not even the remains of the temple itself. These are only the temple foundations and podium. In other words, the gargantuan construction works necessary beneath to uphold the heft of the temple itself. Although gritty and lacking all the gold and marble splendour of the past, these dimensions alone make you gasp. Scholars argue over the size of the actual temple, but a common estimate is 60 by 60 metres. That's 200 by 200 feet. But there's more to gasp at. In 1939, in the times of Mussolini, the museum decided to add a basement gallery, and when excavations for the construction of that gallery were conducted, they discovered something remarkable. Another temple. A temple, moreover, with enough intact, including its broken cult statue, to identify it. This is the Temple of Vetiovis, attested in the ancient literature, and then, in the 20th century, seeing the light of day once more. Up close to Jupiter's main temple, it's physical evidence of the presence of this deity in this most divinely charged landscape. And despite being a god you might never hear of in your explorations of Roman history, it's evidence that he was worshipped up here, right alongside Jupiter himself. This is all the more intriguing because we know Vetiovis was, one way or another, an anti-Jupiter, an inverse and opposing Jupiter. This is wrapped up in his very name, which has variations. You might hear Veiovis, or Vediovis, or even Diovis. But it's all the same god. All of them retain the Jovis part, Jovis being Jove, another name for Jupiter. So Jupiter is embedded in the god's very name. However, the prefix Ve or Vedi modifies and changes the name. The 2nd century writer Aulus Gellius explains a sinister meaning. Gellius says the prefix Ve in Vetiovis is privative. That means it takes something away from whatever you add it to, in effect, turning something into its opposite. This happens in English when sane, for example, becomes its opposite with the addition of a prefix, insane. Gellius explains the same thing is happening here. Ve in Latin means not or less. So ve sanus, for example, means insane. So what does Veiovis or Vediovis mean? Not Jupiter, a less Jupiter, an un-Jupiter. And what does that mean? What do you imagine the opposite of Jupiter might look like? What might the opposite represent? We've met the poet Ovid several times already now, putting a happy and sanitized face on the religion of his time, which was, not incidentally, the time of the Emperor Augustus, who was busy sanitizing Roman religion and also identifying himself and his new role as Rome's first emperor as Jupiter's earthly regent. So we can see there were ulterior motives for putting a squeaky clean face on it. And it's no surprise that this is exactly what we seem to find Ovid doing. He acknowledges the antiquity of the deity by locating a cult of Vetiovis up there in the very early days of Rome. Remember that wild vision of the pre-urban Capitoline in episode 3 when we discussed Terminus, at a time when we said the hill was wooded and crackling with numinous powers and unknown gods? Ovid situates Veiovis up here at that time, in the place between two groves, where Romulus would create his asylum, which invited in all the nascent city's first inhabitants. So he assigns Vetiovis a place in Rome for as long as there had been a Rome. But he says some peculiar things after that. Reflecting on that ragtag assortment of people who fled to Romulus's asylum, Ovid says, "Oh, from how small a beginning the Roman took his rise! How little to be envied was that multitude of old!" Then, with no segue and no link that makes any coherent sense, he reverts immediately back to Vetiovis. "But that the strangeness of the name may not prove a stumbling block to you in your ignorance, learn who that god is, and why he is so called. He is the young Jupiter. Look on his youthful face. Look then on his hand, it holds no thunderbolts. Jupiter assumed the thunderbolts after the giants dared attempt to win the sky. At first, he was unarmed." He then poeticizes about the thunderbolts and Vetiovis's lack of them before getting back to the name. He suggests that country folk used ve in words for undersized things, like vescus for scanty. What Ovid suggests is that Ve is a diminutive, like let in English. It makes things smaller, younger, cuter, book to booklet, for example, or pig to piglet, and drop to droplet. That's what Ovid says is happening with Vediovis. He's a Jupiterlet, or a Jupiterling. So lesser, yes, but this explanation takes away any antagonism or sense that this deity had anti-Jupiter qualities. If that is the meaning of the word, Ovid concludes, may I not suspect that the shrine of Veiovis is the shrine of little Jupiter? And there he leaves off entirely and moves on to Pegasus, but even posing it as a question like this, may not the shrine of Veiovis be the shrine of little Jupiter? We can easily perceive that he's actually speaking against a different understanding, a different vision of the god, and certainly one existed, and we will turn to that in a moment. But part of what Ovid was describing was true. We know that Vediovis was always portrayed as a young boy, a young beardless youth, Jupiter before he came of age. And like Ovid suggests, he's also usually, but not always, portrayed with arrows rather than thunderbolts. Here's a very famous bronze statue of the god, and it's the thunderbolt he clutches. The fact that Ovid plays down his access to the thunderbolt is very interesting in terms of our series because he's restricting access to that ultimate divine weapon and reserving it for Jupiter in his proper incarnation. His explanation is logical and mythological because the god in his youth had not yet fought the Titans and had not yet been given the divine thunderbolt. But we already know by now that the Greek myth need have little real bearing on the actual presence and Roman nature of this god. Because of his clean-shaven face and the arrows, he's sometimes confused with Apollo, but Vediovis was always depicted with a goat. And the goat has nothing to do with Apollo and everything to do with Vediovis. This youthful, benign Jupiter can seem quite appealing, and his association with the goat also has a mythological explanation because when Jupiter was an infant, in hiding in Crete from his father, who wanted to destroy and eat him, Cretan nymphs were said to have fed the young Jupiter, and, as Ovid says, it was a she-goat that gave her milk to the infant Jove. So that's all very nice and idyllic. Perhaps suspiciously so. If we turn back to what Ovid called the strangeness of the name, we can extrapolate that the crack he was also papering over was the strangeness in the god himself. If Ovid protests too loudly that this is a harmless little Jupiterling, what was the alternative he was avoiding? Aulus Gellius, who took the other darker etymology of the name to mean in essence an anti-Jupiter, also reveals the alternative tradition. Ancient etymology wasn't a science, and it's usually wonky, but just because the origins they traced for words were not accurate doesn't mean they aren't useful. They tell us a lot about what people thought and how they perceived things. What will the etymologist make of Vediovis? Asked Cicero, who highlights the charged nature of the name while avoiding telling us anything at all about the god, except that he knew about him well enough. So Gellius tells us that Jove, the archaic name of Jupiter, derived from the verb juvare, meaning to help. So Father Jupiter was, despite his tempests, overall a helping deity who first and foremost protected and served Rome. By contrast, Gellius tells us, they named a god Vediovis as the opposite of Jove, one who has the power not to help, but to harm. The anti-Jupiter is therefore the inverse of Jupiter in his most fundamental inclinations. And we can see that, too, if we do a double take at his young face, which we might imagine full of all the blissful innocence of youth. But equally, we could imagine it full of that wicked, antagonistic perverseness and belligerence of some young teenage boys. And malevolence is exactly what Gellius ascribes him. To support this, he observes that the cult statue in Vediovis's temple holds arrows, he says, which, as everyone knows, are made to inflict harm. And if you think of shining Apollo and his arrows and instinctively want to push back against this, Gellius reminds us that Apollo, for all his light and song, also brought plague and death, and people who collapsed suddenly from unknown ailments were thought to have been struck by the shafts of Apollo's arrows. Vediovis seems to have filled a similarly pestiferous role in Rome. He had a second temple down on the river, on Tiber Island, where he was associated with the temple of Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing. So his ability to do harm with his arrows seems also connected in this way with sick and ailing humans. To pay your respects and to give him all due attention in his temple was clearly sometimes a propitiation and an attempt to persuade him to keep his dreaded arrows away. But there's more to his existence as the antithesis of Jupiter than youth and wickedness. He seems to have been chthonic, like Sumanus in the previous episode. If you remember, these are deities of the earth and the underworld rather than celestial deities of the sky. That certainly puts him in a very different orientation and realm than Jupiter. And this is where the goat comes in. Something that writers tell us repeatedly is that Vediovis and the goat were so closely associated, even his cult statue incorporated the goat by his side. Ovid fits this in nicely with the Greek myth of the she-goat that nurtured young Zeus, but what Gellius tells us about this goat is quite different and tells us a lot more about the Roman cult of Vediovis. What he says is at once mystifying and startling. He tells us that the cult of Vediovis demanded the sacrifice of a goat, but it's the way that the goat had to be sacrificed that raises the hairs on your arms. Gellius says it had to be sacrificed in the ritu humano, in other words, in the manner of a human sacrifice. Now, if you want to make yourself really unpopular as a classicist or ancient historian, start talking about human sacrifice in the classical world. That was in the past a surefire way to get yourself debunked as a kook and as no one to take seriously. It's because of the pedestal the classical world, and in particular the Greek world, sat upon right through the Victorian era and beyond, as the supposed origin of all the West's most lofty ideals. Dark and barbaric practices like human sacrifice clearly had no place there, ever, not even in the mists of its earliest days. Despite the fact that the Greek hero Achilles demands human sacrifice for the funeral pyre of his beloved friend Patroclus, slain in battle, despite the fact that Agamemnon has to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia to get a decent wind up so his fleet can sail to Troy, and despite any number of other similar such references, it has long been the tradition, still upheld now, although less vehemently, that these were just stories, like people turning into trees or being abducted by gods. There was nothing in these stories, they say, that we should take as being true or offering a glimpse into cultural practices. We should not even imagine that these stories contained memories of discontinued cultural practices still lingering in the popular imagination. No, just no, take it away. It's still the general knee-jerk reaction, although there's plenty enough evidence now to make it quite clear, I think, that human sacrifice was practiced in Greece and on the Italic Peninsula, just as it was most everywhere else in the ancient world in various times and circumstances. So that's a subject for a whole other video, and if it's something you'd like to know about, let me know in the comments and we can go there. But for now, it's enough to say that Vediovis was offered a goat in the human rite. While people will argue until the cows come home about what precisely that means and what the human rite could mean in the Roman context, what is clear is that the goat was most literally a scapegoat, that is, an animal offered as a substitute for a human. And however much the lofty Romans of our sources turned their noses up at the idea, and however offensive they found neighbouring cultures that they knew or suspected of practicing human sacrifice, there are enough telltale signs like this one that it had also been practiced once upon a time in Rome, or at least the threat of it was there, and so where humans were involved, the stakes were high. And we don't even need to relegate it to the distant past. Even into the historical period, the Rome of our written sources, humans were sacrificed a few times that we know of, to the horror of the historians recording them. Live burial in times of dire danger is the most famous of these. And so we can only imagine what happened to those poor doomed goats sacrificed to Vediovis, just as we can only imagine what happened to the doomed humans, real or imagined, who were once in their place. In any case, the shine comes off this statue somewhat when seen in this light. We see that just like Summanus of the Night Lightning, here is another clearly powerful and feared deity whose powers were not only in contrast to those of Jupiter's, but held in tension. That Ovid situates him in Rome's earliest days on the wilder Capitoline hints perhaps of the practices involving goats that his audience knew about and probably partook in. Given that their strange sacrificial nature evoked earlier in much different times, these would have seemed better explained if situated in that unruly, uncivilized, distant past. I don't think it gets enough attention that Ovid doesn't glorify early Rome as he usually does at the particular moment he is imagining Vediovis and his early acolytes. It's quite strange for him to exclaim, "How little to be envied was that multitude of old," when he often otherwise looks back with fond nostalgia and even wishes to rewind to simpler times. Something about the cult of Vediovis, as imagined in early times, made that an unenviable prospect. The cult statue was found buried on the Capitoline and is therefore, like the temple itself, a remarkable survival. Unlike the cult of Summanus, who the Roman elites distanced themselves from and whose temple ended up over at the foot of the Aventine Hill, Vediovis remained a presence on the Capitoline Hill, right up there beside the Temple of Jupiter, for the longue durée of Roman history. We know a temple was vowed to Vediovis on the site in 200 BCE, during the Battle of Cremona in the Second Punic War against Carthage. The general, with a cracking name, Lucius Furius Purpureo, vowed to build it, if successful, before his confrontation with Hannibal's brother Hamilcar and the Gallic army he was leading of 35,000 men. The battle was a pivotal one which effectively quelled the last major Gallic rebellion in Cisalpine Gaul during the war. With the Gauls crushed and their Carthaginian leader Hamilcar captured, Rome could turn its full attention southward to his brother Hannibal and the ongoing war effort without worrying about its northern front. But the question is why, of all the gods and at such a pivotal moment, would Purpureo choose this one? The question lies completely unanswered, and maybe it's unanswerable, but for our purposes we can see that the god had a presence in the religious imagination of Purpureo's day, and not an insignificant one. This was not a moment to be messing about with trifling deities, nor was it a moment for experimentation. Evidently there was something about Vediovis that carried the right weight and that suited the context and made Vediovis the right god to appease or supplicate at that anxious and loaded historical turning point. I don't think he had a vision of a youth frolicking with goats in mind. At the bare minimum, we can suspect he was appealing to the malignant power of Vediovis to do harm and to bring destruction. But we might have expected him just to appeal directly to Jupiter for help. What was Vediovis's edge, his particular relevance here? If I were to speculate, I would add this. The human sacrifices I mentioned that happened in Rome in historical times are obscure and bizarre and shrouded in mystery, but something consistent across all three of them, however, is the live burial of two couples. Two Greeks, and perhaps not coincidentally two Gauls, were buried alive. There are theories, but no one knows why. Whatever the sacrifice was, it wasn't a new invention, but a residual echo of a very old practice turned to in desperation. The last instance had occurred during the same war, only 16 years previously, after the Battle of Cannae, when Rome had suffered a terrible defeat and was in fear and existential crisis. Well in living memory for Purpureo, in other words. That means he would have been fully aware of the event and its significance in the context of the Punic War. And it was such a disturbing but powerful event. We might imagine what impression it left on the young Purpureo and wonder whether the memory of that gruesome human sacrifice factored into his own military and religious decisions later, including his vow to Vediovus. If Vediovus had similar connotations of human sacrifice, if not a direct association with those historical ones, then this malefic, inverted, chthonic anti-Jupiter would be a fitting recipient for a wartime vow for precisely those qualities. After his victory, when the new temple was indeed dedicated on the Capitoline, perhaps on an earlier cult site, again we can only imagine what happened to the goats sacrificed on that day and what, or better who, they were understood to represent. On balance, Vediovus is an unsettling deity. The evidence for him is an uncomfortable combination of things, and I think the sense we get of him is right. I think it's a disturbing combination of things that Romans too would have responded to, and although they might sometimes have wanted to harness the powers of that cruel youth, just as often they would have wanted to propitiate him and keep him at bay. Even if Vediovus received a PR stunt in Augustan Rome and his boyish charms were brought to the fore, he seems always to have carried this extra charge, and indeed he sometimes carried Jupiter's thunderbolt as well. Pliny the Elder mentions the cult statue in the temple of his day in the 1st century CE. It was very old and made of cypress wood, but it burned in the great conflagration of the Capitoline in 69 CE. The cult statue we have now is made of marble and must date to the rebuilding of the new temple under the Emperor Domitian, sometime in the late 1st century. And that his temple was rebuilt, and in marble, should tell us more than all the silences surrounding this god, that this deity went nowhere. He was a fixed and revered part of Rome's religious landscape and of the ritual and architectural landscape of the Capitoline Hill for the entirety of Roman history. So, if you ever go to the Capitoline Museum, after marvelling at the giant foundations of Jupiter's great temple, do go down into the basement and pay your respects to Vediovus, a god Rome could not forget and a force it dared not ignore. The city's defiant un-Jupiter is still standing.